Okay, let's talk biosphere. So, I love this topic. This is one of my favorite lectures of all time. And a lot of the feedback that I get from this lecture is, especially for this class, is why are we talking biology in a geology class? And you'll see why. But I also have been pretty adamant this term that the reason I chose all of the spheres that I did and all of the topics that I did is because they're all interconnected. My master's degree was in biogeochemistry. I studied the relationship between biology, geology, and chemistry because it's hard to discuss one entity without the other. And today we're going to learn about the biosphere and how that pertains to geology. And I love this topic. It's one of my favorites. We're going to look at geologic time, which means we're going to break down geologic time into four entities, four units, basically. We're going to look at relative dating, fossils, and relative dating. But not dating your relatives. Gross. I'm funny. This is some new vocabulary we're going to use. We're going to look at. So to preface this, and I've talked briefly about this concept many times, geologic time, and sort of the vastness that this topic entails. Earth's history spans 4.6 billion years old, right now as we know it. And these are the different units that we break our Earth up into. Let me move me down to here. So we break our history of Earth into four units: the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Now, let's really break it down what we're looking at. We are here. If you don't see my arrow, I'm up in the yellow area, the Cenozoic. This line here is us right now as we are in this moment. We are in the Holocene epoch, and we are in the Quaternary period. They're in the same time frame, but one we consider a period, the other is an epoch. We have more ages. We'll talk about age in a little bit, but one of the reasons it's blank here is because scientists are sort of arguing, not arguing, but we're discussing making this the age of humans. So how do we do that? We're not going to turn this. We have made this into the Anthropocene, which is, as you'll note, one of your modules coming up after cryosphere. So we have a few things to discuss here. Here's this. This is where we are right now. The Cenozoic spanned from right now to 65 million years ago. The Mesozoic spanned from 65 million years to 250 million years. The Paleozoic spanned from 250 million years ago to 540 million years ago. And 540 million years ago is the beginning of the Precambrian. The Precambrian went from 540 million years ago to 4.6 billion years ago. We're going to look at this here in a second. I'm going to put this in perspective here in a moment, because this map is not to scale, as you can imagine, right? This is not a scaled time frame. What we are looking at are these huge sections that we break apart into smaller and smaller and smaller units. And so the question is, why? I ask my Geo 101 students this question all the time. Why did we feel the need to break up all of these different periods into smaller ages, into different entities? Why are we doing this? Why does it matter? Because we have had so much happen in the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, geologically, biologically. That was a weird way to say that. Biologically, there we go. Basically, huge world-changing events have occurred in these three moments, in these three units of time. Let me go to the next page because I think this will help put this into perspective a little bit. I have my students, my Geo 101 students, turn geologic time or condense geologic time into a calendar year. This allows them to really put this time into perspective because how do you wrap your brain around 4.6 billion years of time? It's like impossible, right? Humans span 100 years of life. So how could we possibly wrap our brain around 4.6 billion years of time and the things that have happened in that time? So if you condense it into a calendar year, this is what we're looking at. From the 1st of January until the 19th of November is the Precambrian period. The Precambrian period was the very start of Earth until 540 million years ago. But if you condense this into geologic time, this takes up most of Earth's history. It takes up 10 and a half months, which is wild, right? And the crazy thing too is the reason it's like this and the reason it doesn't have a lot of lines going on in it and different ages and different periods is because this is basically nothing is happening. We're going to break this down even further. But geologically, biologically, not a lot is happening in the Precambrian period, which is crazy because the 19th of November until the 12th of December is the Paleozoic. Look at all the stuff that's happening in the Paleozoic. And this was for like a month. This happened at the end of November to mid-December. But there is so much happening in this time period versus the Precambrian. We'll talk about what those things are. This portion here, the blue, is our Mesozoic time period. And spoiler alert, this is when most of the dinos roamed the world. But the dinos were really only there. Oopsie, I went too far. The dinos were really only there for maybe 2.5 weeks of Earth's history. Finally, this last little segment here, this little yellow segment, is the Cenozoic. This is the era, the age that we're in now. And humans are all the way up here. And technically, human ancestry expands several million years, but common humans, modern humans today, have only extended in time about a couple 100,000 years. 100,000 years. Which means that if we were to condense the amount of time that we have been in this calendar year, we have been here for about a minute of Earth's history in geologic time, meaning we've started the countdown to New Year's Eve. And that's when humans arrived, was the countdown for New Year's Eve. Isn't that crazy? So I hope when you get to New Year's Eve this year and you're doing the countdown, if you can stay awake that late, because I can't, but if you can, you'll really suss out, oh, I just had the longest year in 2026, and we are down to the last 60 seconds. This is when Earth popped into, or this is when humans popped into Earth's history. I love putting things into perspective like that. It's wild. So how do we know? How do we know how to break these time ages up? How to break up this age? How to break up Earth's history? And it all comes down to geology and biology. It is the meet cute of bio and geo, and it comes down to fossils. And we find fossils in rocks. Now, I would love to say, and I just had this conversation with my Skagit Rock and Gem Club, because I'm a member of that. I'm on the scholarship committee. I just had this conversation with them, and everyone was like, well, all fossils are in sedimentary rocks, right? They have to be because they get deposited over time, and then you get animals that fall in those layers, and then they're deposited over those layers. But this is not altogether true, and we're going to see that. We are going to talk about relative age determination as per fossils, how fossils fit into that. What I'm not going to talk about in this lecture is radiometric age. I think it is important, but I'm going to ask you to sort of push that aside and take my word on radiometric age determinations. Now, you're welcome to do your own research on it, absolutely. There's some good sources that you can find on scientific articles. But basically, the concept behind radiometric age determinations is we take elements from the rocks in which they form. So they have to be volcanic rock in nature, because as soon as that volcanic rock cools, these crystals form, and we can take those elements from the crystals and we can date how far back the rock cooled into existence using isotopic computational data. So it takes technology. We've only been doing it for a few decades now, a few. We've been doing it for probably half a century, by radiometrically and analyzing these rocks using isotopic information. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. We can get very specific dates as to when these rocks cooled. Now, I say that you cannot do that with sedimentary rocks. Because remember, sedimentary rocks form from anything. You get this erosion and weathering from rocks all over the place that end up in one location. So we can't radiometrically date sedimentary rocks. We have to use other methods to do that. And we do that using relative age determination and the fossils that are part of those sedimentary rocks. But I'm going to start by breaking down geologic time, and what each age indicates. So this first age we're going to talk about is the Precambrian. And the Precambrian was on the furthest right of that map. It's the pinky colored one. This is the one that spans from January 1st to November 18th. It spans a really long period of time. And the reason it spans so long is because very little happened during it. From 4.6 to 4 billion years ago, we had nothing. The Earth was fire and molten lava and death and destruction, which is kind of cool. And our oldest known rocks are about 4.3 billion years old. They're in Australia. Well, the oldest minerals are in Australia. The oldest known rocks are actually in Canada. And they're about this old, which is so cool. It's my dream to go there, obviously. But we don't actually start to see anything really interesting. I say that. Of course, rocks forming is really interesting, but we don't really seem to see anything interesting until about 3.4 billion years ago. And 3.4 billion years ago was in the Archean. So here's this here. And it was in the Paleoarchean era. Yeah, Paleoarchean era was when we first saw signs of life. We move into 2.5 billion years ago, into the Proterozoic, and this is when we started to see single-celled organisms, algae, sponges, and a few animals with shells, which is wild. Let's talk about the first organisms that we believe we have found. And again, what I love about this topic is these are the first organisms that we have found. This does not mean that these are the first organisms to have ever existed. This is as far back as we have been able to trace based on geologic and scientific data that we have found. But there's a good chance that there were entities that formed earlier and they just never survived a fossil record. They never made it into the fossil record. So we will never know. Or there is another chance too that there's something out there that we haven't found yet. So that's what I love about the science is that, yes, our first living organisms were bacteria. They were single-celled organisms, and they're about 3.4 billion years ago, which is still incredibly old. But maybe there's something older that we just haven't found yet. The oldest ones that we have found, though, are in these greenstone belts in pillow-basalt lavas. So basalt, if you recall, forms at the bottom of the ocean at a divergent boundary and a mid-ocean ridge. So the Atlantic Ocean has the mid-ocean ridge, the mid-Atlantic ridge. And remember that that plate boundary is being pushed apart because magma is coming from under and pushing two plates apart at a divergent boundary, and it forms an ocean ridge. And as that magma cools very rapidly, we can collect radiometric dates of these rocks. So we've dated these rocks to 4.6 billion years ago. And you're like, okay, cool. So some basalt. We found some basalt. Mind you, it's igneous, not sedimentary. The first fossils that we believe that we have found, which are bacterial, which were single-celled organisms, were these tube casts. So they were a cast made by these bacteria. And there have been quite a bit of analysis, and there has been a lot of back and forth because tube fossils or these cast fossils can be really, really hard to date because they're not the actual remnants of, or sorry, they're not, that's a bad way to put it. They're not the actual physical organism themselves, right? They are the burrows that these organisms made. So these organisms like burrowed their way into this rock and formed these tube casts that we then found in the greenstone belts. But the evidence suggests, based on a few other things, including what I'm going to talk about next, that there were some cross-cutting things through these organisms. So something cut through this organism after a certain amount of time. It was another igneous rock cut through some of these fossils. Um, and these inclusions that cut through them were about 3.4 billion years old as well. So we have evidence that says, yeah, okay, just because these were casts, though, we still believe that they're 3.5 billion years old because of these other isotopic data that we got, so the radiometric dating that we got, and these other rock formations that dated to 3.5 million years ago cut through these organisms as well. That's all part of relative dating that we're going to talk about. The other and very predominant early biological entities that existed look like this. These are modern versions of them. These are called stromatolites. And the oldest known fossil stromatolites are about 3.5 billion years old. These ones I think were in Australia, but we found stromatolite fossils in Canada, in Greenland, in uh, I want to say like Wisconsin has stromatolites. There's some Midwest state that weirdly has stromatolites as well. Basically, what stromatolites are is they're a layered deposit, predominantly limestone. If you remember limestone, it's just smooshed up shells that run one over the other and that form a rock. These organisms formed colonies called microbial mats, and they were made up of a bacteria known as cyanobacteria. Think about if you're familiar with coral, it's a very similar idea. Coral is also a limestone or a calcium carbonate. And there are single-celled organisms that sort of live in coral. They're an animal. Coral is technically considered an animal. This was the same idea with stromatolites. A little bit different. Biologically, I don't actually know how, and I don't want to get into it. But think about how corals and stromatolites are similar in that they're a shell-based organism, but they have little organisms in them, so they're animals. And these organisms formed colonies, and they're made up of cyanobacteria, which is some of the first bacteria we believe existed. Whew, I'm talking so fast, it's hard to breathe. This is what fossilized stromatolites look like, and these were cut. So I mentioned that they sort of layer on top of one of each other like this. They form these layers, these mats. Oh, here we go. So this is what they look like now. Kind of gross. They look like snot. But basically, these bacteria just sort of layer themselves one on top of each other. The inner ones will start to die. The outer ones will start to build outwards, as you will, into like a coral shape. Well, not a coral shape, I apologize. Into like a coral premise, the same way that coral grows. And cyanobacteria are incredibly important because they were alive. They were also photosynthetic, meaning cyanobacteria took in carbon dioxide and water and light, and they turned it into sugar to form biomass. So photosynthesis occurs when you form sugar, and it forms this biomass, but also produces oxygen. Now, this is important because oxygen, this was the first time that oxygen really entered Earth's atmospheres. It was about 3.5 billion years ago. And when that happened, geologically, this created some of the coolest structures that I know. And I have two samples in my room, and I'm very excited about them. They're my oldest known rocks that I have. So they're about 3.5 billion years, or 2.7 if you look at when oxygen was at its peak. And these are called BIFs, or they're called banded iron formations. So basically, bottom of the ocean. You get a couple rocks that form at the bottom of the ocean. You can get shale or you can get chert. Um, and both are sedimentary rocks. We talked about both of these. Chert is technically a biological or a chemical, pardon me, it's chemical, not biological. It's a chemical sedimentary rock. And shale is a clastic sedimentary rock. Both can have iron in them, or iron inclusions in them. And so when these sedimentary rocks were forming and they had high amounts of iron, they would form these like whitish, blackish, grayish bands. Okay, iron, it's black. The minute that oxygen was introduced into the ocean from cyanobacteria and the process of photosynthesis, this iron bonded with oxygen and became iron oxide, and it turned it bright red. So cool. So anytime there was an abundance of oxygen in the ocean, it would bond with the iron in these rocks and form a band of red. So what we have here is the history of when oxygen was first introduced into Earth's geologic history. And what's really cool about this is that oxygen didn't just appear and stay there. Oxygen had this really weird cyclical um, cycle. That was a cyclical cycle. That's redundant, whatever. Where we had a period of no oxygen, and then all of a sudden we had a period of oxygen, and then we had a period of no oxygen, and then oxygen and no oxygen, and then so on and so forth. So what we found historically is that not only did we know that oxygen was cyclical, but we also found that the biological entities that produce these were also cyclical. So just in seeing this in the geologic record, we found we got a biological history, we got a chemical history of Earth, we're getting a geological history of Earth because it's all connected, right? So because oxygen was now introduced and we're getting, so 3.5, we got some oxygen producing bacteria appearing here. This was the rise of oxygen in Earth's early atmosphere. And here, this blue is oxygen, oxygen, bloop. And then all of a sudden, we get this huge fucking jump in oxygen. And you guys are going to look at this in lab this week. You're going to see how much oxygen was in Earth's atmosphere earlier in Earth's history versus today with a really cool program, which you used in lab 2. So you'll get to go back and use that really cool simulator and look at how fossils and how Earth's atmospheric composition has changed over time. So oxygen in the form of readily available oxygen, O2, so this is the oxygen that we breathe, was produced by plants and it was vital for animals. And thankfully, it became very abundant. Uh, Oxygen is imperative for most life on Earth. It's hard to say all life because as we are learning new things about different types of organisms, we're finding that some organisms thrive on other elements. But we as humans and animals and well, I guess not plants, animals predominantly need oxygen to survive. So this is why Earth is a habitable planet because we have so much oxygen. So that was basically all the cool things that happened in the Precambrian, um, up until November 18th. A little bit of life and some oxygen. Woo! This is why we put that into a single scale there. Even though it wasn't scaled exactly, you got to see it in the calendar. Not a lot happened till we get to the Paleozoic. So the Paleozoic, we saw some animals with shells back here. But shelled organisms didn't really start to make an explosion until the Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian. This is where we saw a lot of shelled organisms. The trilobites are incredibly shelled. Incredibly shelled. They're shelled. I don't know. I think this might be a giant squid with a shell, which, like, cool. Love to see that. Ammonites. The Cambrian hosted our first fishes. Ordovician, we started to see first land plants, so 485. So here's the Ordovician. We started to see plants. We're going to dive into Silurian, where we saw armored fishes. Armored fishes. You can see that this is a little bit shorter. Devonian period, we saw insects and amphibians and fishes. The Carboniferous is probably one of my favorite periods, and I'll talk about it a little bit more because I know I put that slide in here. This is where we really started to see trees, the trees that we know today. This is also where we saw our first reptiles. So the Carboniferous, I mean, just in my opinion, is one of the most amazing periods that really hosted a lot of incredible life. We're going to jump back to the Cambrian here. So 540 million years ago. This was a moment that scientists have named the Cambrian explosion of life. So most of the creatures that evolved during the this period were soft-bodied. So if we go back to this period in the Cenozoic, I don't want to say the wrong one. Ah, in the Proterozoic, pardon me. Proterozoic, in the Neoproterozoic, and the Proterozoic. Um, Sorry, I don't want to scroll through all of that again. We saw a lot of soft-bodied organisms. This is where organisms first started out. The other thing to note in the Precambrian is that because many of them, I'm pointing at these ones, because many of them were soft-bodied, they didn't, it was difficult for them to remain as part of the fossil record, right? Soft-bodied organisms tend to just decompose away. And if they're soft-bodied and they hold no bones, like worms, like slugs, we're not going to see a lot of evidence left behind after their death. It really takes hard parts like shells, like bones, to really bury into a sedimentological record for a fossil record. So another really cool thing is that just because these existed doesn't mean there weren't more. Millions more species that we just don't have a record of and never will. Same with our first living organisms. Just because this is the first one that we have found doesn't mean that that was not the first one that was. We might not have a record of one prior to this, or, which might be even better, we just might not have found it yet. TBD. TBD. So this Cambrian explosion of life was a really big deal because at the beginning of the Cambrian period, here in our uh, Paleozoic age, we started to see shelled creatures and hard parts being left behind. Um, Many of these organisms began to evolve hard parts, and that's because it allowed for, oh, it doesn't say. Reasons for a creature to make a skeleton. I mean, think about it. You're going to have more protection. It can allow for more mobility. A spine, having a skeleton is going to allow for far more mobility. It's protection, it's safety. There are so many reasons for a creature to make a skeleton. Um, I get to go here this summer, hopefully, if it's not on fire. Do I have a bigger picture of it? No. So 8 hours from here in Skagit, I'm in Burlington, is the Burgess Shale. And you're gonna look at it a little bit in lab this week too. And the Burgess Shale is a shale which deposited at the bottom of the ocean, and it is one of the most diverse fossil assemblages in the world, meaning that there's more fossils in the Burgess Shale than we found almost anywhere else. There's more different types of fossils. We have soft-bodied fossils in there. We have hard-bodied fossils in there. I'm so excited to go. You're not allowed to take a fossil, which I probably actually won't. I usually say that and I'm like, don't take a rock. But the Burgess Shale is a World Heritage Site, and because it is still being regularly studied by so many scientists, it actually would be bad to take a fossil. So I'm not going to take a fossil from the Burgess Shale. Also, I think you get a fat fine if you do, I'd imagine. But I'm going to take so many pictures. It's going to be amazing. The Devonian period was when we started to see vertebrate animals make their way on land. So this is the Tiktaalik, which was the first animal that we have a fossil of that had both lungs and, does it say here? Yeah, lobed fins and lungs, meaning that it had to have found its way onto the land because any marine organism that lives in the water had gills up until now. This was an organism that had lungs. It was like wild. Um, This is also a tree that formed in the Devonian period. So we're not to the Carboniferous period yet. And what I will say is trees were forming prior to the Carboniferous, but we had very like ferny uh, forests at the time. Coniferous and, oh God, what's the other tree that's not coniferous that sheds its leaves every year? Oh God. The type of tree that sheds its leaves every year in the fall. We did start to see some of these trees in the Devonian period. And because of the evolution of plants coming onto land, this really started to shape landforms. And we started to see landforms change into these river systems that became braided because you had these trees and these plants start to form. And because we started to have trees and plants also start to form, we started to see soil. Now, soil is a geologic proponent that is predominantly sediment. So anything that's coming from the mountains, any type of rock weathering entity is going to form soil. But the other proponent you need to make soil is organic material. So dead plants. We didn't start to see soil until plants made their way up into Earth's surface, and soil became an integral part of Earth's surface. Once we saw that soil, we started to see more plants grow. Soil has organic matter, which is a nutrient that plants really, really need. And so after this initial exposure of plants onto land, we just saw an explosion of plants. And this brings me to the Carboniferous. Ah, my favorite. So the Carboniferous was a period in which there was an explosion of plants, huge plants. The other thing to note too is that there were a few periods in the Carboniferous in which there were no ice sheets on the planet, no glaciers at all. And because of this, the entire planet was just plants. Many areas that aren't tropical now were tropical in this period. So when you get environments like that, you get marshes and you get swamps. And marshes and swamps are they're waterlogged, so there's water in them. You have a lot of soil. You have a lot of dead plants that fall and then get buried very rapidly. And because they are waterlogged, this also means that the water isn't moving. And when you have standstill water, you get what's called an anoxic environment. No oxygen can make its way into standstill water. When you move water, that stirs oxygen into the water, and that is good for fishes, right? Because fishes need oxygen in their gills. But when you form an anoxic environment and you have plant matter in it, the plants can't decompose because there's no organisms that will decompose these plants. So these plants continue to get smooshed over time. There's no decomposition because they're in an anoxic environment, meaning that they are going to form a rock. And they form a sedimentary rock called coal. So coal, any type of coal, is the remnant of a tropical environment, a marsh-like swampy environment, where there was no oxygen and it's all just dead plant mass. All of our coal reserves in the world, well, okay, most of our coal reserves in the world can be traced back to the Carboniferous period because there was so much plant life and there was so much swampy marshland environment that we get a lot of coal from this period. The other time we get it is about 50 million years ago. Yeah, here's 100 million years. So 100 million years ago. And if you're not familiar, do I show it here? No. Both Bellingham and Skagit, well, Whatcom County and Skagit County were both big coal mining towns. And that was part of our economy when we first started these counties a couple hundred years ago, was in coal mining. I do talk about this. I talk about this in the Anthropocene module. I remember now. But I'll talk about it now. Our coal reserves in this area actually came from about 50 million years ago, not the Carboniferous. Carboniferous is predominantly going to be on the Midwest and eastern coast of the US, but our local coal here came from about 50 million years ago. We've also had a few, okay, well, I'll talk about it. This is a map, and I think you see this in your homework or your lab this week too, of the 3 of the 5 mass extinctions that have occurred. And these all happened in, this is why I put it in here, because this all happened in the Paleozoic. So in the Paleozoic, there were 3 mass extinctions that happened 445 million years ago, so about here, between the Silurian and the Ordovician. The Devonian, This one says 375 to 360. So yeah, about the Devonian into the Carboniferous. And then the Permian extinction, which ends the Paleozoic entirely. So this is the top of the Paleozoic here. Um, and the reason that these mass extinctions, so we find these mass extinctions because we find these fossils in different layers of Earth's sedimentological record, which we'll talk about here in a second. And we will reach areas of sedimentology that don't have any of these fossils ever again at all. So we know these extinctions have happened because none of these organisms continued to exist in our geologic record. So the Mesozoic is the next period. Welcome, dinosaurs. So the Triassic is at the bottom here. This was 250 million years ago. And this was the fossil assemblage of the first dinosaurs that we found. Jurassic hosted first birds, and the Cretaceous hosted our first flowering plants. So what's wild to me is I showed you the calendar. Dinos ruled Earth's calendar for about 2 weeks, maybe 2.5, if we bring in some of their ancestors. But dinosaurs ruled the Earth for 2 weeks of Earth's time. Well, we've only had a minute. We've had a minute. And dinos were here for 2 weeks. They were here for a long time. And the different fossils that we have found, some of these dinos did not exist at the same time that we think they existed with other dinosaurs. But they were Earth's kings. They ran Earth as their kingdom for, what, 200 million years? Let's look. Yeah, about 200 million years. Um, and they stayed for a long time because they continued to evolve. But they had lungs that allowed them to thrive. A gastrolith, I believe, is the taken for oxygen, to thrive and grow very, very large. And then they died. Actually, during the dino period, there were two mass extinctions. There was the Triassic, which was at the end here. There was an extinction here at the end of the Triassic. But then the big one, which was for sure, we are all very, very, very certain. We're 99% certain. We have a lot of evidence for this, and a lot of people have done a lot of studying and research into this, that an asteroid struck. I keep wanting to say Baja, Mexico. It's not Baja, it's on the other side. Uh, there is a crater on the eastern side of Mexico in the water. It's called the Chicxulub crater. And we have traced this crater back to the destruction of dinosaurs for many, many, many reasons. But I'm not going to get into those. It is funny teaching online because I kid you not, this section was what, 2 slides? And I probably spend Geo 101 talking about dinosaurs way more than I normally do, or should, or want to. I love dinos, but my students are just really into dinosaurs. I get it, they're cool, but like, we gotta talk about more stuff. Like the Cenozoic, which is our modern age. So this is where we saw the rise of mammals. So these reptilian dinosaurs, they really dominated Earth's surface for 200 million years. But when that crater hit, when that meteor hit, reptiles are cold-blooded critters, and they need heat from outside sources. So if you ever had a lizard, you put a little heat lamp in there so the lizard can go out and sun itself. And what happened with this crater and this huge meteorite was a meteorite came in and it basically sent so much sulfur into the atmosphere that sulfur and a bunch of other things, but sulfur was the big one. And it clouded Earth for decades, cooling the planet. So it cooled the planet. And it wasn't that a lot of these dinos died immediately. A lot of them did. And we have evidence of that. But a lot of these dinosaurs, it took a long time for them all to die out because all of a sudden they weren't getting the heat source that they needed and they were used to. And so they died. And instead, mammals came and thrived. And mammals have evolved from all these different animals into our ancestors, into what we are now. Oh, so the Mesozoic era ended dramatically, mass extinction. Okay. I do talk a little bit about some of the evidence. This is the iridium boundary from the asteroid impact. The iridium is an element, and iridium is only found in asteroids. And we found a layer here that denotes the death of the dinos. We call it the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, the KP boundary. This is the Chicxulub crater. Here it is. Um, Yucatan Peninsula, that's what it is. Good Lord, I couldn't figure it out. It's the Yucatan Peninsula. We're going to keep going though, because I want to talk mammals. So, free from the competition of dinos, mammals underwent a remarkable adaptive radiation. In just 12 million years, most modern organisms, can trace their ancestor back to 12 million years. That's not that long a time, right? And remember that the Cenozoic that we're in right now, the mammal-dominated era, was only about 6 days on on the calendar year. So this is just human ancestry, and the last common ancestors that we have shared with gorillas, hominids, chimpanzees, and bonobos. These ancestors have split off into different genuses, where we have found gorilla, where we have found chimpanzees, and here we are, Homo sapiens, up at the top. So we share a common ancestor with modern day chimpanzees and gorillas, but we are not the same as chimpanzees, bonobos, or gorillas. This leads us to a whole other topic, so much so that we're going to have a whole conversation about this next month, in 2 modules. But I think it's important to bring it up now. So now we are in this period of time where we have defined a new epoch. Humans, the existence of humans and our impact on Earth's systems is so dramatic that we have named ourselves an entire period, and we call it the Anthropocene. We define this period for the last 11,500 years, basically when the last glaciers receded. And we're going to talk about glaciers in the next module. I'm very excited about it. It's my favorite topic. All these topics are my favorite topic. So when the glaciers receded was when we really started to see a lot of human activity take over a lot of the lands. We can trace human and hominid activity back to Africa. However, the first humans in the Pacific Northwest, and I think I talk about this in the next module, but the first human evidence in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State is about 15,000 years ago. We believe that we have found human artifacts in Olympia or south of Olympia that trace back to 15,000 years ago. So those were our first indigenous persons that sort of habitated these lands. And after that, 11,500 years, humans really started to make an impact. In this period, we have seen rapid population growth of our species and the development of modern civilizations. Because of this, we understand, or we have anticipated, that our fossil record that we are going to leave behind, this generation, not just our bones, but we are going to leave behind a layer of plastic. And yes, some of this are like obviously layers of plastic bottles and rubber tires and all of these things that don't decompose wholly. But if you are not familiar with this concept of microplastics, plastics can break down into smaller and smaller pieces, but they don't decompose very quickly. And so, and I do talk about this in the Anthropocene module. But because of this, we're leaving behind tiny, tiny little remnants of plastic in our sedimentological record. That in millions of years, if humans manage to survive, or maybe we come back, I don't know, and they're digging through a fossil record and they find a layer of rock and they do chemical analysis on it, they're going to find a layer that has a high level of hydrocarbon, which is plastic, and they're going to say, oh, this is the Anthropocene. So I keep talking about these layers and stratigraphy and the sedimentological record, and you're like, what does this mean, Emily? So glad you asked. This comes down to relative dating. So numerical dating specifies the numbers of years that have passed since an event. And this comes down to radiometric dating. So we can radiometrically date rocks, igneous rocks, to say this rock is 250 million years old. But sometimes we can't radiometrically date a rock. Sometimes we have to relatively date a rock based on the sequence in which these rocks have formed. So now we're going all the way back to geosphere. When we look at layers of rocks, ooh, do I put it? I do. You guys, I'm so smart. When we look at layers of rocks, for example, the Grand Canyon. I'm going to go back to the last slide in a second, but I think seeing a visual is really helpful. When we see layers of rocks like a Grand Canyon, think about, and I talked about the principle of original horizontality in the geosphere. Remember that as layers are deposited, they have to be deposited in horizontal layers, as per the laws of gravity, as per the laws of physics. And so we have these layers that have built up the Grand Canyon. Now, another important law that apparently I didn't put in here is kind of intuitive, but I'm going to describe it anyways because I think it is needed to be said. Maybe it's not intuitive. Maybe that's just a geologist in me. But as we build these layers, we're building one on top of each other as time goes on, meaning that our oldest layers are at the very bottom of the Grand Canyon. And as we go up in layers, we get younger and younger and younger. So our youngest layers are at the top. This is relative dating. This is me saying this layer here is younger relative to this data, this line of stratigraphy, relative to this layer of stratigraphy. We are younger up here, we are older towards the bottom. So this also goes into play with fossils. Fossils tend to form predominantly in sedimentary layers. And so when we look at sedimentary layers and we look at a layer down here, we're going to say, well, this has to be the oldest layer because as we go up, it gets younger and younger and younger and younger. And I like this picture because it shows the geologic time. This is the Precambrian period, the Archean and Proterozoic. And then we have our Paleozoic, we have our dinosaurs here, and we have our mammals in the Cenozoic. So it's a roadmap to how we look at Earth's history without necessarily needing to say this fish is exactly 0.416 billion years old, so 400 million years old. This dinosaur is 145 million years old. We don't necessarily need numbers to say, well, this dinosaur is older than the mammoth here or this leaf based on how far down it is in these layers. I wanted to put this one in here because this is the principle of cross-cutting relationships, meaning that these rocks here behind it, these red rocks, have layers associated with them, meaning that these rocks had to be layered one after the other, one after the other, youngest on the top, oldest on the bottom. And only after they were layered did this volcanic intrusion sort of cut through these layers. So there was some lava or some magma that cut through these layers after these layers had been deposited. This is the law of cross-cutting relationships. Because this cut through these layers, this is telling me that this is now younger than any of the layers that it cut through. Because these guys had to be deposited first, and then this guy cut through afterwards. This is what we found in the greenstone belts in our first fossils. We found our fossils sort of embedded in the greenstone and those pilobasalts. And then we found intrusions that were cutting through these fossils. And we could date the intrusions because these are igneous. So we could radiometrically date these and say, oh, these were 3.5 billion years old. And it's cutting through these fossils that are in the green belt. And so that allowed us to date those fossils, even though they were just tubes, they were just remnants left behind by organisms. Guys, it's so cool. On your homework, you're going to get a block that looks like this. And what I'm going to have you do for this block is tell me, in what order do you think these layers were deposited? You're going to want to follow these rules and these laws. I don't know why I didn't put a slide of law of superposition in, but you get a whole snippet here, so I'm not going to add a slide. Basically, law of superposition is that older rocks are below newer rocks. Um, the law of cross-cutting relationships, igneous intrusions are going to cut through stratigraphy and are younger. The law of original horizontality, all layers have to be deposited horizontally, and only after that can they be changed to be tilted or to be folded. We also have what are called unconformities. So let me go through this real quick. If I were to say, label this in what you think is oldest to youngest, you're going to automatically start at the bottom and be like, okay, well, we know that everything that's older has to be at least close to the bottom. So let's look there. So we're going to find that I is probably the first layer deposited. And then, based on the principle of original horizontality, if this layer here is I, and it's layered like this, if it had been horizontal, G is parallel to that, and then D, and then A, and then J. We're going to jump over here because J is horizontal to A, or sorry, oh my God, parallel to A, and then F is parallel to J. So I would go I, G, D, A, J, F. But then some weird shit starts happening. Then we have this weird blue line that I've labeled as M, and it cuts through a couple of things. But it also cuts through this guy. Oh, I'm sorry, that's N. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. It's because it doesn't. That's N. We're back to M. So here's M. M is this line here, and it cuts off I, G, D, A, J, and F. So at one point, this rock was layered horizontally. Something happened that made it tilt. And then something else happened between F and L that made this section tilted, but this section not. And what we do is we call this our unconformity. M is an unconformity. What this means is that between the time that F was deposited and then L was deposited, something happened where we saw tilting and then a bunch of this material got eroded. And we don't know necessarily how long it took for it to get eroded. We don't know how it was eroded. All we know is that this material was tilted and then it was like cut off. It was eroded away. The environment then had to change to deposit L on top of this unconformity. So unconformity is a layer that represents missing time because stuff happened between F and L. We don't know how much time it took. We don't even necessarily know everything that happened. We just know there was tilting and that there was erosion that occurred. And because of that, we don't know how much time that took. But all of a sudden, we have another layer, L, that was deposited, and then B, and then K, and then E. Those all occurred. And they layered one on top of each other because of the law of original horizontality. Now, this is where now it makes sense. The law of cross-cutting relationships, both H and C are igneous dikes. And you'll note that C is cutting through both the bottom portion of this block and the top portion of this block. So C has to be younger than E and younger, it has to be younger than E because it cuts through everything. And then we see that N, so this is where N comes in, N cuts through just C, but you'll note it doesn't cut through H. This is a fault. A fault is basically where it's sort of a boundary, a plate boundary. Think of it like a boundary, but it's not on the scale of a plate boundary. So it's not a different plate. It's just part of the rock that slips and breaks and shifts. And so this boundary here slipped after C had been intruded. But H cuts through all of that. So H is sort of the final product of oldest to youngest. This is our youngest unit, is this igneous intrusion because it cuts through this fault and it also cuts through C. So if I order this from oldest to youngest, I'm going to go I, G, D, A, J, F, M, L, B, K, E, C, N, H. You guys get to do something similar in your homework. And that is relative dating. This is ever, so the reason I'm having you do this is because this is the idea, this is the concept behind relative dating, is understanding when these layers and these geologic entities formed relative to each other. So, how do we bring fossils into this? How is this a biological biosphere as part of this class? Fossils are traces or remains of prehistoric life preserved in rock. And paleontology is the study of fossils. So, knowing the nature of life that existed at a particular time helps researchers understand past environmental conditions, climate, um, the geology of the area, the ecology of the area. Like fossils are so important to so many different areas. And I did have to break it to a 10-year-old last week that she wants to be a paleontologist. And I was like, well, you're going to have to study geology. And she's like, no, I don't. I was like, yeah, girl. Yeah, you do. Because you're going to dig in rock and you have to know the kind of rock you're about to dig in. She was so mad because I just sat and talked to her about rocks the whole time. And she's like, stop, I don't care about rocks. I care about fossils. And I was like, well, bummer for you. So paleontologists study fossils. So we're going to bring this all together and talk about how geologic time periods come together with fossils and relative dating. We talked briefly about conditions favoring preservation with fossils, but most organisms aren't preserved. They get broken down. Even bones or shells will get broken down over time, turn into fine powder. What we need is rapid burial of these organisms and the possession of hard parts. That's going to increase the chances of preservation. So when I say rapid burial, in a sedimentological system, we're going to find rocks we're going to find fossils where more sediment has just been buried over it. One of the best places that we find rapid burial is in the ocean, the deep ocean. Because the deep, deep ocean, the bottom of the ocean, is very rarely um, bothered, if that makes sense. And we are constantly burying sediment on organisms at the bottom of the ocean. Um, so we correlate stratigraphic units or these layers of rock with this principle of fossil succession. So we understand that fossils are arranged according to their age. Um, and this is how we have denoted that map of geologic time. A fossil assemblage is just a group of fossils that help determine a rock's age. But index fossils are really fun because they are a widespread fossil and they are limited to a short period of geologic time. So we use index fossils to help ascertain different layers of the earth across the globe. So what does this mean? So glad you asked. I'm going to come back to that slide, but just because I'm on this topic. Imagine, set yourself in this mental state. Millions of years from now, somebody is digging through the stratigraphy to find human fossils. And they dig and they dig. And yes, we're looking for plastic, but we come across a Lego. Oopsies. Do you think that we can really ascertain the year that this Lego existed? Now, Legos are very popular. So yes, they are widespread. We're going to see these worldwide, and that's awesome. That's great. But Legos came to be from 1932. I know I put the year in. So Legos have existed from 1932 until today, and I'm pretty sure they're going to continue to exist for a long time because tiny humans love Legos. Grown humans love Legos. I love Legos. Um, so Legos are going to continue to exist. These are a very long time duration of human history. So an archaeologist digging through the dirt and finding Legos, like, cool, humans once existed here, but we can't really get a small window of time. Now he's digging and he's digging and he's digging, and then he comes across a fidget spinner and he's like, wait, this is 2017. This is from the great fidget spinner explosion of 2017. Fidget spinners are so confined to a very strict time frame, and yes, they still exist today. But if you recall the great fidget spinner explosion where people were buying boxes and boxes of fidget spinners like fucking Beanie Babies, and they were like, they're gonna be worth millions of dollars. No, they're not. Anyways, they're gonna be worth millions of dollars. So people bought like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of fidget spinners to sell later on because they really thought they were gonna be worth a lot of money. And then they were like, wait, they're not, so we have to do something with them. So then they ended up in landfills and the ground. This fidget spinner is a fossil. I'm sorry, duh. It's an index fossil. Not only were fidgets widespread across the globe, but they were confined to a very short window of human history that we can look back and say, if we find a layer of stratigraphy that has a fidget spinner, that means that humans, this was probably 2017. I don't think we can radiocarbon date plastic. I don't know. I actually haven't really thought about it. So we do the same with fossils. We look at different fossil assemblages and we see what fossils existed for a very short amount of time but were widespread. Trilobites are actually a really great example of an index fossil. They didn't survive for a very long period of time, but they are across the globe. There are these creepy little guys that sort of look like crabs, and they're dead now. They're very extinct. But we have this fossil assemblage, or we have this fossil that will help date how old they are. These guys lived in the Cambrian period predominantly, I want to say. They were part of the Cambrian explosion. In a rock unit, we might have a bunch of different fossils that existed, and once we know the general time frame in which these fossils existed, we can put different fossils together and say, oh, well, the trilobite, the squirrely thingy in our ammonite here, is part of fossil assemblage A. That means that this is confined to a very specific period of time from 540 million years ago to 400 million years ago, because it had all of these fossils in it. And then some time passes and we get another fossil assemblage that has this guy and this guy in it, but it also has all of these guys. And I'm sorry, I should have brought into play that these three fossils here have existed from the oldest period to our youngest period. These are terrible index fossils because they're in every single assemblage. But we do have an assemblage that has blue ammonite and orange ammonite, meaning, oh, well, this has to have survived potentially from, what did I say, 400 million years ago to 200 million years ago. And then we have an assemblage or a rock formation that has orange ammonite, uh, orange curlicue, crabby, and then these three guys as well. So then all of a sudden we have another assemblage that has different fossils associated with it that will allow us to date this assemblage. So fossils are important because they're like a puzzle piece. And once we figure out, oh, well, we have this fossil and this fossil here, that must mean it's from this time period. But if we only have a fossil, if we only have blue, let's see, if we only have trilobite in a fossil assemblage, then it's probably not, it's probably older than 500 million years ago because there was only trilobites before this guy and before this guy came to be. Now, of course, there are some problems associated with that, right? Because if I say, okay, this layer here only has trilobites, meaning it's the oldest unit, and it was before white curlicue came to existence, I could very well be wrong. Maybe trilobite and white curlicue were both existing here, but we just don't have a record of the white curlicue. So this is entirely dependent on which fossils sort of decide to be fossilized in that period. We might not have some of the data, and we may never will. But it is a really good starting place. And what we have found is that, yes, this is a really accurate depiction of past environments in different geographic locations. Because fossils lead to our understanding of how an environment was in the past. So most fossils are found in sedimentary rocks that formed as sediment accumulated on Earth's surface. So as such, sedimentary rocks, which are the best rocks, are records of ancient environments where organisms lived. And this is why I love sedimentary rocks, because they tell the coolest stories. The fossil record in sedimentary rocks provide evidence of life in marine environments, in marshes, in rivers, in terrestrial environments, desert environments. So we're going to find organisms that lived along these environments that make sense. And we do this by inferring the organisms that live there now. I did put this little snippet in here. Fossils may also be sometimes found in volcanic rocks, but didn't destroy evidence of past life. This has happened in a few cases. First of all, the greenstone belt scenario at the beginning of this lecture. The other one that's really big is the Ginkgo National Forest, Petrified National Forest in Washington. So I think ginkgo. Oh gosh, I should know this. There's a petrified forest in central Washington before you hit Vantage, just along the Columbia River on I-90, I believe. I think it's ginkgo. It doesn't matter. You can look it up. You can find it. And it's petrified wood that has been fossilized in um, lava. And it's basalt lava. We had a basalt lava flow that flowed through that central Washington area about 17 million years ago. And what we have inferred from this is that these fossils formed because the petrified wood that was there were once remnants of trees. And these trees were so wet that when the lava hit them, they didn't immediately just burst into flame and burn away. They were so wet that they were actually able to cool some of that lava as it went around to them and left behind these petrified wood molds. So not always are they in sedimentary rocks, but most fossils that we find are in sedimentary rocks. And this is generally what we tend to find. We have shell fossils. So the way we infer these environments is through modern environments, right? Shells, seashells, live in the ocean. This is a marine fossil assemblage telling me that at one point this rock and this environment was underwater, was under an oceanic water. Fish is also going to tell me it was water-based. However, we don't know necessarily if this was, unless you're a fish biologist, if this was marine or a lake environment or a river environment. In this case, I do, because these fossils are actually very famous. They're from Wyoming, and they're from the Eocene period, and it was a big lake of fish in Wyoming. And the hypothesis is that there was like a big acid or pH drop in the water, and we're not entirely sure how. But it killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of fish, buried them at the bottom of this lake. Hi, Henry. And they were rapidly buried by more sedimentation. And I actually have two of these fossils in my lab at school. They're really, really cool. But yeah, they were buried very quickly in there. And you can go out to Wyoming, and they allow people to take them because there's so many of these fish fossils. They're incredible. And then finally, we have these leaf fossils. And these leaf fossils, it looks like, is in some kind of sandstone. These are carbon imprints, meaning that these leaves fell, and before they were able to degrade, more sandstone was sort of buried over top of them very rapidly. So they couldn't decompose fully, and they left this carbon imprint in the sandstone. We see a lot of this in the chuckanets. So the chuckanets, if you're not familiar, which you should be because I talked about them in the geosphere, here's us, Mount Verney. Chuckanets are just north of us. And the chuckanets host these incredible leaf fossils. This is a palm frond. It shows sycamore tree. It also has, and I have not seen these in person, but we have crocodile footprints in the chuckanets. We have a turtle fossil in the chuckanets somewhere that nobody will talk about where, because nobody wants to have it dug out. We also have I don't know if I believe this, and I will wait to see it, but one of my colleagues is so adamant that this exists. We have a hippopotamus fossil somewhere in the chuckanets. Like, if you can show me, I'll believe you. Even if you just show me photos, I'll believe you. I don't know if I believe them, but this is indicative of an environment. So what we don't see in the chuckanets are shell fossils, are fish fossils. We just see leaf fossils or terrestrial animal fossils, crocodiles, hippopotamus. Maybe. Meaning that the chuckanets were not a marine environment. They were a terrestrial environment. And they were a meandering river at one point. So the chuckanets were a river on the scale of like the Columbia River. It was huge. And it's about 55 million years old. And it also was in an environment that was very tropical at the time, which is why we see these palm fronds. So about 55 million years ago, and it's not like the latitude changed. And hopefully you saw this when you did the tectonic plates lab for this class. but the latitude of this region didn't change, meaning that this area wasn't necessarily closer to the equator. What it means was, in this period of time, there was likely little to no ice caps on Earth, and most of this area could be tropical, and it was a riverine system. So not only was it tropical and a riverine system, but remember I talked briefly earlier in this lecture, and I'm sorry, this is a long lecture, we're almost done, that when you have a tropical environment, you get a lot of marshlands and swamps. And these marshlands and swamps uh, were able to preserve plants and push them down into coal. So the Chucknuts also had a lot of coal. We didn't actually mine a whole lot of Chucknut coal in Skagit and Whatcom, but we do have very present coal veins, and there is a coal vein that you can go see if you go up to Teddy Bear Cove on the Chucknut Drive. If you walk down to Teddy Bear Cove, it gives you like this little spit, this little tiny little island thingy just past the railroad tracks. To the left, if you go to the left side of this, I don't know, rocky bubble, at the very base of this rock is the tiniest little coal seam. It's about an inch thick and it's black. I should get a picture of it one of these days. But it brings me back to this area being a coal mining town because we had a lot of swamp. She's being so dramatic right now. I need to trim her nails. We had a lot of swampy marshlands about 55 million years ago, which I did mention was well after the Carboniferous period, but it presented a lot of environments that were able to preserve coal. So that is the biosphere for you. It's one of my favorite topics. I know this was a long meeting and I apologize, but I appreciate your patience. Oh, I'm going to say Henry. Henry says goodbye. And we'll see you for cryosphere next week.